Welcome to another episode of Break the Silence, Build the Future. I'm your host, Fortuna Kuso. This season, we have been exploring the many facets of grief. Today, we are diving into the role that community plays in the grieving process and how collective support can help us create a meaningful understanding of the loss we had suffered. Our conversation today will focus on actionable steps communities can take to support those experiencing loss. Joining us are two incredible guests, Rabbi Jodi Kornfeld, Beth Shavrin, Humanistic Jewish Community, and Rabbi Adam Chalom of Kol Hadash Humanistic Congregation. Together, they co-edited the book, Contemporary Humanistic Judaism, Beliefs, Values, Practices, which offers a profound look at how humanistic principles can shape our response to life's challenges, including grief. Their work emphasized the power of action and community in fostering healing, which ties beautifully to today's discussion. Rabbi Kornfeld and Rabbi Shalom, thank you for joining us. I'm thrilled to have you here today to share your perspectives and expertise. And I would really like it if you could take a minute to introduce yourself so our audience have understanding of your philosophy in humanistic idea.
Well, thank you, Fortumo. It's so wonderful to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and by extension with the people who listen to your podcast. My name is Rabbi Adam Chalom. I'm the rabbi of Kol Hadash Humanistic Congregation in suburban Chicago. I'm also the dean for North America of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, which prints materials and trains rabbis and leaders to help serve the broader Jewish public as well as humanistic Jewish communities. Humanistic Judaism is a cultural Jewish identity that focuses on the human experience, human knowledge, human power, human responsibility, that is then expressed through Jewish cultural connections, holidays, life cycle events, history, language, food, all of those aspects that make up a cultural identity. And we find that our community is very valuable for that emotional support necessary when someone is facing a loss. We'll talk more about the ways that community can be particularly helpful in that. But our humanistic approach to life also has a role to play because we want to face reality. When we've lost someone who is close to us, we know that for the rest of our life, we will not see them again, we will not touch them again, we will not hear them again. And if we face that reality, we can then become used to this new world without them. It's a harder world. Sometimes it's a dimmer or sadder world, but we don't get to choose the world we live in. We have to face the realities. And I think that a humanistic approach gives us the strength that we need to deal with those challenges with our own strength, but also drawing on the strength and support of other people.
I'm Rabbi Jodi. I'm the rabbi of Bethlehem Jewish Community in suburban Chicago. I was ordained by the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism in 2009, started my congregation 22 years ago, actually. And what I have found is a complete philosophical, religious, cultural home that I raise my children in humanistic Judaism, that it provides me with a grounding, it provides me with a source of my identity, and it gives me meaning in my own life. I echo very much what Adam has said, describing humanistic Judaism, and those are the points that we make in our book. Also adding to said that we know when we suffer a loss that for the rest of our lives that we will not be able to communicate, to see that person any longer. But I think it goes even beyond that, because in humanistic Judaism, there isn't a sense that after we die, that we're going to be reunited with that person, that instead we're confined to the natural world and that our time on this earth is limited. And so our actions become even that much more important, that we have to do what Greg Epstein describes in the excerpt that we have in the book, is that we engage in a life before death, that we're not taking a look at what comes afterwards. Instead, bad things will happen. Our philosophy allows us to accept it. On the one hand, that might seem like it's not very comforting, but on the other hand, it's very grounding, and it allows us to invite other people into our lives, to be part of a community, to accept help when we need it, to be able to reach out. And I think as rabbis of each of our congregations and as leaders in our movement, we can help spread that message so that when we encounter families who are dealing with the death of a loved one, we can celebrate that person's life in our eulogy of that person. That it may bring tears, as I often say, but it may also bring laughter, because it presents a very full picture of who that person was, what their place in family was, and what their place in community was.
Thank you very much. That's an interesting way to look at it, and that whole idea of human role. So if we can start our discussion today and wanted to gain understanding of what humanist response to grief looks like. We have both spoken about the importance of acknowledging that bad things happen in life, often beyond our control. So instead of focusing on what can be changed, you emphasize the importance of how we respond to that loss, how we respond to the challenge, whether the loss is a loss of life of a loved one or a job you really wanted or relationship that dissolved. We feel the pain that comes with that loss, but you emphasize the importance of how we respond. Can you share more about this philosophy with us?
Sure. So by acknowledging that bad things will happen, it allows us a level of acceptance. We're not looking for some divine plan that we're not privy to. We are not looking for somebody to blame for it. Sometimes we're to blame, right? When you talk about a relationship breaking up or something like that. But certainly if a person dies and we're dealing with that kind of a loss, there isn't some bigger plan. Instead of trying to figure out why bad things happen to good people, as the phrase goes, that's only 1/4 of the picture, because we know good things happen to good people. And we're going to embrace all of it. And I think that our humanist perspective allows us to accept that. Now, with grief, what ends up happening is that we have a new landscape to navigate, and that takes some time. And the grief really never goes away. And I think the greater your depth of love for somebody, the greater your grief. However, it starts to become more manageable and a bit more proportional.
Mm-hmm.
And that helps us a lot. I'm reminded of the words of the poet, the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai, who said, "We live in the eternity of others. We are their eternity." And so through our memories, through our stories, we keep that memory alive. Person we've accepted, though, has died.
Mm-hmm. So Adam, in your writing, you talk about the importance of action in fostering community and fostering healing and creating this process where we go through and accept the fact that life will be forever different when this loss happened, loss of a loved one, and it's beyond our control. Would you be able to give us real examples of what communities coming together to support grieving members could look like, or real life examples of when that happened and it produced comfort for those that suffered that loss?
Absolutely. One of the chapters in our book describes a humanistic approach to the ritual called Shiva, where after someone has died, the family will gather in a home, generally, and people will come to visit them. Traditionally, that was over the course of 7 days. That's where the number Sheva in Hebrew is where the word Shiva comes from. Sheva means 7. Nowadays, that Shiva is a more flexible thing. It may be 2 days. It may be 1 day. If someone's had a long decline in a hospital, the family has had what I sometimes call a pre-Shiva, because they're all together and people are seeing them before the person has died. But from our perspective as humanistic rabbis, anything from a religious tradition evolved in response to human needs. It was created to meet a human need. When someone is dying or someone has died, we feel more lonely. And so having other people around us help. We feel like we'll be forgetting them. So sharing memories can be a healing process. We might need to eat, and people bring food to the Shiva gatherings. It's almost a cliche how much food shows up at the Shiva gathering sometimes.
Yes.
And one of the chapters in the book where we talk about life cycle events includes an article by our founding thinker, Sherwin Wine, about how sitting Shiva is not a function of obeying traditional commandments and covering mirrors and sitting on low stools and all of the prescribed official rituals. It's meeting the human need for community, for connection, for comfort. And that's why we keep it. As humanistic Jews, we're not required to do everything from tradition. We are allowed to choose from this cafeteria, this library of options that are all part of our inheritance. And so when my father died, he actually died just before Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, some now 8 years ago. Of course, it was a challenging time for me and for my family, but I was so gratified at how many members of my community stepped up to help me in preparing for the services, created a space for me to process my own grief, shared their own stories with me about their loss. And again, as you feel a loss, you might feel more alone, but I felt more connected to other people even than I might have been before. And so that's where I found a community to be a wonderful comfort. And I know Jodi has other comparable experiences.
Sure. So my husband died almost 9 years ago. It'll be 9 years ago, actually, in another month. And my community was so supportive. Obviously, we had to keep a congregation running, and nobody let the ball drop. I didn't have to worry about that. So I felt very lifted up and uplifted by that. I found that when we were planning different events, when we were doing community service, for instance, that doing good made me feel good. It made me feel connected to something larger than myself and helped me get back into the world, even though those were done with small steps. My congregation also knows that I tend to be an emotional person, and they give me the space for that. So at the holiday of Yom Kippur, there's a memorial service, and a part that's called Niskor is what we call it, which is that we remember. And it involves a reading of all the names that people submit. And while each individual person may be feeling perhaps like a renewal of their grief, they also realize that they are part of a larger community of other people who've gone through that, and that they are part of a long tradition and a long ancestry or kinship, as Rabbi Wan liked to call it, with other people in our community, in our wider community, in the Jewish community, etc. And so I think that that's been very helpful. And I've toyed each year with, should I read my husband's name first or should I read it last? I've decided on last so that I can get through all the other names. But I know that as I'm getting to that point, I'm supported by my entire community, even if they know that that's going to be a tearful moment for me.
That's such a powerful message of how our healing can come from actions we take, but not only the actions we take, but connections we build with other people. Grief can sometimes, especially living in the West, in my experience, I come from a culture and background where that 7-day practice and bringing all that food takes place. But I found here people don't really speak to the grief. They speak to the loss, the fact that you lost a loved one, but they don't speak to it. It's almost everybody is afraid to address it or to speak about it. You hear all the time family requests privacy, which makes sense, but it doesn't offer that community. Therefore, grief often feels isolating, because for me, when I went back to work after losing my daughter, people didn't really know how to deal with me. They didn't know what to make of me, how to approach me. I felt like I needed to comfort other people and tell them I'm okay, you don't have to worry about me, which was challenging. Yet one of the most healing forces, as the collection in your book talk about, is the human connection. So how do you see communities stepping up to create safe spaces for people to mourn and process their loss without feeling like everybody has to tiptoe around this person, around the loss, and not know how to approach it?
You know, I think when Adam gave the example of being right, happening right at Rosh Hashanah, and the example of my husband, as leaders of our community, I think that helps us model what we need and how people can be supportive. And so when people will say to me, I'm keeping you in my thoughts, that phrasing is very helpful to me. So I think that part of it is that we can model what it is that we do. I think also that we can be encouraging of people to say it's okay, to feel uncomfortable. This is a difficult subject. And in our culture, people are uncomfortable speaking about death. I think that it forces them to deal with their own mortality, and that makes it difficult. But by the same token, it's okay to be uncomfortable, if you will, And so when we say to people, I try and edit my own language very carefully with families that I'm dealing with, is not to say, how are you? Because the obvious answer is, how do you expect me to be? Right? Instead, to say, what have you been doing? And that helps them focus on their role in the world, role in their family, what other things are going on, while at the same time acknowledging this is a very difficult time.
Mhm.
I think that one of the values of having a community of shared beliefs and values and cultural traditions is that you can get the language that you need to be helpful. So from our perspective, again, focused on this world and this life and not anticipating a future life, we don't have to hear from our own members, God needed another angel, or you'll see them again, as if you don't have the rest of your life to live without them. There's a lot of things you can say wrong to a secular person when they're dealing with mourning that aren't helpful to them. And then they have to decide, am I the ungrateful person who says, well, I don't really believe that? Or do I just smile and nod, as you said, I'm comforting them as much as they're trying to comfort me? In some cases, the traditional Jewish approach actually has some wisdom to it. In this case, when you go to a house of mourning, traditionally you sit quietly and you wait for the mourner to start the conversation. If they want to talk about the person who died, that follows their direction. If they want to talk about something else, the weather, the news, you are there for them, for what they need. And so the generosity of listening, the generosity of responding to them is a wonderful cultural teaching that we can pass along to our communities. And I guess the last point that we can offer that we find particularly helpful, there is no one correct way to mourn or to process the loss. So traditionally, there are prescribed actions for the first 7 days and the first 30 days and the first year, and you're supposed to follow this calendar. And some people find that comforting. And there's a Yiddish phrase for that, Gesundheit, that you do what works for you. That's great. But you shouldn't feel like you have to do it that way. Traditionally, a torn ribbon or a torn piece of clothing is worn for those 7 days of mourning. But if you want to take off that ribbon on day 3, take off the ribbon on day 3. The rituals were made to help you. You were not made to follow the rituals. It's a real fundamental shift from a humanistic approach to religion. And I think that we find that it provides much more comfort to give people permission. After all, when someone has died, you don't get over it. That's the Western idea. You're going to get over it. You get used to it. It's a new reality that you have to find, how do I handle this? And sometimes there's going to be some random piece of music that comes on the radio and I start to cry because it reminds me of that moment. I was talking with my children just the other day that when I put something into the microwave, I'll put the time on 111 or 123 because my father always did that. He thought it saved time. Instead of picking some other number, he would just do 111, boom, and then he saved 3 seconds in his day. It's ridiculous. It doesn't save any time. But the way I fill out the microwave reminds me of my father. And now it's a happy memory. It doesn't make me sad. And so that's a positive way to evolve into getting used to the new reality. That's part of the grieving process.
I was going to say that as we are able to speak about our loved one who has died, it lets other people know that it's okay for them to talk about that person as well, to be supportive. And so that's part of the modeling. When my husband first died, some people in my congregation were very, like, as you said, tiptoeing around it. They just didn't know how would that be received. If they said his name, was I going to fall apart, And then when I'm able to talk about it, they can chime in with things that they remember about him. And the other point that Adam was saying, that, there's no one way to do this. And we should be humble in the face of grief. Say, that's it, we're done. No, it will pop up when a song comes up. It will pop up when we pass by a certain place, sometimes with a big smile, because it makes us chuckle at the memory. Sometimes it's with a little bit of a tinge of sadness as well. And everybody has their own timeline. My personal example, I cried every day for 18 months. I learned there were differences between crying and sobbing and weeping and tearing up. I mean, each of those things They were not all of equal value. And then finally, I realized that he was taking up more space since he died in my life than he did when he was alive. We were never together 24/7. He went to work, I went to work. And I think being able to process that was helpful.
Hmm. So there are several things that stood out to me in that answer. I consider myself religious. I'm the praying type, but still, when I suffered loss, I still feel the human loss or the pain. I had this social concept of, if ever a mother lost a child, then she should fall apart and never be able to get out of bed. But I wasn't like that. So the way I behaved in that loss didn't match the social concept that I had. And I didn't really know how to explain to people. My grief was like kind of like shutting down. And friends would say, we couldn't reach you because you didn't answer the phone, which I wanted them to come and see me, but I didn't want to deal with the phone and the text and the back and forth. I couldn't host people. I couldn't accommodate and make tea. And I started speaking about my loss publicly. Then I had two camps, group that felt like I was too strong. Almost the loss didn't shatter me as much as it should have. And other group that felt like maybe I was pushing them away. And I started questioning myself and saying, did I not love my child as much as I should have? Did I not feel the pain of the loss? So I wasn't seeking support for my friends and for my community. And I'm from a big family, and even within the family, struggled to speak to each other about it. We didn't know who is where in that continuum of dealing with the grief. And then I came to the understanding after a year and a half is that there is, like Adam said, and you repeated, that there is really no one way to grieve, and there's no one way to feel the pain, and there's no one way to do it. Whether you believe in a divine being or not, there is the human issue to deal with here and now. But despite the importance of community, many people, including myself, seem to struggle to either accept or seek support. What do you think could be some of the biggest barriers that prevent people from reaching out and asking for support or accepting support?
Well, I think you've highlighted a number of them in your sharing of your own experience. There's our discomfort with explicitly expressing emotion in front of other people, the willingness to cry or even to break down in public because it makes other people uncomfortable. That's a real challenge. I think another challenge that you highlighted is the fundamental difficulty of understanding that other people's brains and other people's emotions work differently than your own. So what you might find comforting, someone else might not find comforting. And what they would naturally do to comfort or how they imagine they would respond may not be how you respond. And we naturally project onto the world the way we think and the way our brain works. So one of the universal challenges across culture, religion, and identity is accepting the fact that other people are different than you and they're going to have their own process. So what we can try to do to surmount that challenge is to train people in empathy, to train people in more psychological sophistication to understand the concept, but also to train people to shut their mouth once in a while. You don't have to share everything you think. The difference between thinking and talking is the lips. So once in a while, that being present for someone or asking someone else, what do you need? What can I do for you? Not assuming that you know what they want or what would be helpful. And sometimes their answer might be, I don't know. Maybe we don't know what would make us feel better in the moment or right away. We know what doesn't. So sometimes it's a process of elimination, but we can be more explicit in articulating our needs that will help other people be helpful to us. And sometimes it's, can you pick up the dry cleaning? Could you pick up the kid at school today because I'm busy? Sometimes very small practical things give us the space we need to breathe. I did a funeral for one family, and I'll stop with this. A funeral for one family. They had two small children, a little bit older than my own. The husband had advanced cancer and eventually died. And I noticed that the the wife had not cried during the public memorial service. And so I talked to her afterwards about it, and she said, well, I had my 2 kids there. I couldn't let myself fall apart. With my children there, I had to care for them and what they needed. And I said, well, I hope that at some point you give them to someone else to take away, and they will have a chance to have some fun, do something else, and then you create a space for yourself so that you can scream and you can yell and you can bang the walls and you can get out what you need to get out. You have to let it out sometime. And I appreciate the need to care for your children, and public perception is a concern, which it is for some people. That's valuable too. But you need to give yourself space to express what you need to express. So I think that some of those obstacles are public expectations, yes, but also the limitations we put on ourselves and the judgment we put on ourselves.
This highlights how important it is for communities to proactively reach out and create spaces where people feel safe and supported. And it sounds to me, in reading the collection in your book, that's what you try to do. So if you could share with us, how did you go about collecting the pieces in this book, and what was the guiding and the framework you set up and the reason behind putting this book together?
Well, it had been something like 30 years since we had created any kind of major collection of humanistic Jewish thought. Our movement's been around since the early 1960s, so we're over 60 years at this point. But we felt like it was time to collect some more contemporary voices, as well as take the best of the past that would describe this cultural Jewish identity that's focused on human knowledge and power and responsibility. But we wanted to show how we did what we did. So we have chapters on our basic beliefs, our philosophy, how we approach questions of God and nature, how we address the challenges of ethics and being a good person, where we find inspiration, uplift, and you might even call it spirituality, and also how we create community. We have a whole section of the book on our cultural Jewish identity, but also how we define Jewish identity. What does it mean to be a part of the Jewish family, broadly considered? Our movement has an approach to becoming Jewish that's somewhat novel. It accepts people who self-identify as part of the Jewish people. And we are hopeful that this message of the book will speak to people who may not have heard of us before, as well as providing study material and inspiration for people who are already part of the movement. And the last section of the book, we wanted to include practical examples of how we do what we do. I sometimes use the analogy, if you read the rules of basketball but never watched the game, would you really understand how it works? And so in our collection of humanistic Jewish thought, we also wanted to give some example of humanistic Jewish practice. Examples of, if you were getting married, what would a ketubah, a marriage agreement, look like?
Right.
The chapter on the Shiva I mentioned specifically. What do we teach children if we're providing education? And how do we approach issues of studying Jewish sources that may not agree with our philosophy, but are part of our ancestral and cultural past? And so the goal of the book was to provide people with an opening to learn more and to inspire them to study even more than that. Both Jodi and I are very happy at the last section of the book, which we called Go Forth and Learn, based on an old story about a rabbi who was asked to teach all of Judaism in one moment while standing on one foot. And so he gives a short lesson and then says, come and study. It's now time to go and learn more. So for each of the chapters, we have examples of music and movies and television shows and novels and other sources that if someone wanted to explore even more how a humanistic Jew might find inspiration, knowledge, and uplift about ethics or about history or about beauty and art, we give lots of resources to go forth and learn even more. This we see as the first book, but not the last book that some people may read. We want to open the door to more inspiration. And as we said earlier, doing it in a way that's meaningful.
So I think that a couple of things that we were very conscious of. One is that we were giving voice to another generation of humanistic Jewish leaders and thinkers, that previously the only thing that had been out there was from 1995, Judaism for a Secular Age, which is an important book and had a lot of important essays, but it hadn't been updated. And so we wanted to make sure, because some of the thinking has changed. The philosophy has remained the same, but some of the thinking and ways of articulating it has changed. we wanted to make sure that multiple voices were heard, and that included introductions to sections. So when in the Jewish culture section, for instance, when we're talking about literature and Yiddish literature in particular, too often people only think of male writers. And so we made it a point to name by name several women Yiddish writers. So that was another thing that was very important to us. And then that as we were writing the introductions to the essays and to the chapters, there's sort of an axiom in our movement to say what we mean and mean what we say. And we wanted to be certain that we were very, very clear about that and doing it in a very positive way, that we didn't fall subject to a pitfall that might be sort of potentially derogatory to another denomination, because practices and beliefs that we don't engage in are still meaningful to other people. And so we were very careful with that. So that was sort of our process and our thinking in putting this together.
If I hear you correctly, it's about contribution to a community that needed this contribution, and it was long overdue. And Adam had said this will not be the last book, but it might be the first book in the last 30 years that somebody reads. And I think community contributions like your book that creates a framework for a group of people might be helpful to another group of people that might not necessarily even subscribe to that practice, but can look at the idea that's contained there and see, I can see how that is similar to this, or how that can be used to substitute to this. And that's kind of the idea that I read. So if we think about a listener who is listening to this but wants to support somebody who is going through some difficult time, whatever it might be, including grief, what do you think would be some practical steps they can take that will allow them to get beyond just offering condolences and they can get to taking meaningful actions?
Yeah, I think one really important thing as a community is to realize that it's not a one-time shot. In other words, if you make an offer to take somebody out to dinner, or you make an offer to be with them, to have a conversation, and the answer is not right now, not to take that personally as an affront, but instead to realize that person's just not ready, and to sort of keep at it. To also realize that, as we were saying, grief can go on for quite some time. When people amongst my close friends, when they happen to remember the day that my husband died and send me a text or give me a call or whatever it is on that day, I feel very seen. And I think that other people may do that. Not that everybody keeps a calendar of, the losses in everybody else's lives, but if that occasion arises, or if the occasion of, say, Mother's Day or something like that, it's a nice time to reach out to people and say, you might be hurting, so to sort of think beyond the Hallmark card that, you send once and then you're done. And the cards are terrific. Don't get me wrong. People who write those messages, it's very meaningful, but to not be time limited in how you're approaching helping somebody, because the loss, as we started out saying, and as Adam said, we're never going to see that person again. So the loss is ongoing. And in that sense, the grief follows that.
There are also traditions in Jewish life that create a space for us to remember. But he mentioned the anniversary of a death that is often observed in Yiddish. It's called a Yartzeit, the year anniversary of somebody's death. And that's something that a community can also help people with. My congregation holds Friday night Shabbat services, and once every month, we read a list of names for people whose Yartzeit or whose anniversary of their death occurs that time of year. We don't do it every week. We do it once for the month. And if somebody wanted to remember someone else, I always open up and offer, are there other names you want to remember tonight? And other people can speak the names. It could be they missed that person because of a wedding anniversary or birthday. It may not be near the time they died, but they're missed at that moment. So we create a space for them to do that. And as I've worked with my congregation now for 20 years, many of the names on those lists are people I knew and people I knew well. That's part of the blessing and the curse of a long time in one community, is you've had those transitions, or maybe they're the relatives of members that you've been connected to for many years. And so you know what that loss meant to them because you did the funeral for that person. And so we create the space for the community to make that observance. We actually print in our weekly email that we sent out in advance of the service the names of all those that are there. And if you recognize somebody that was related to someone you know, you might drop them a personal note saying, I saw the name on the list. I was thinking of you. It's again that I'm aware of you, I'm remembering you, I'm caring for you. That can be very, very meaningful and valuable. And I guess the last thing that you can do with people who are grieving in the long term is to remember the person that they loved when you're chatting with them about something else and something that their relative did that impacted you or that you remember. You can share that with them. And maybe you both feel a little bit sadder on one level, but maybe you also feel a little bit comforted that you have that shared positive memory of someone who was a positive influence in your life. That's what life is like. It is the bitter and the sweet. It is the sad and the joyful that that person was when they were here. And we have complex emotions. We are complex beings, but we can live in that complexity. That is the true meaning of a meaningful life, is being able to feel all of those things and yet still be present for someone else who is feeling their own version of those complex emotions.
What I love about this approach, as you both have explained, is that it reminds us that even the smallest consistent action can make a profound difference. Because sometimes when somebody lost a loved one, a husband, a father, a brother, a child, we think nothing we say or do will help them, or we think we have to do something big. But like Jodi said, if you call somebody and offer them, if you could drop dinner off or take them out, if they say no today, maybe they'll be open to it a month down the road. So those is small. And like Adam, you said, sending a note that says, I'm thinking about you today. Or Jodi, like you said, when the anniversary of your husband's passing comes, somebody saying, I thought about you today. Those small things. I like how you both brought up that idea of those small steps. Don't think they don't matter. It's about being present. It's about being there for each other in a ways that would matter to the person, even if you don't think it's this huge Olympic size act.
They help you to heal somewhat. 2 years ago, my son took me out of town on the anniversary of my husband's death. He and I went on a trip, and I thanked him afterwards because I said, you've taught me a really important lesson. I said, you taught me that I can be both joyful and sad at the same time, that they're not mutually exclusive. And that was a really important lesson for me. And I think that anytime we, as leaders of our community, have a personal experience, I think it makes us better at what we do, because we can speak without having to give that example, but speak from a place of empathy and experience.
Well, I think this is really a beautiful insight into the human condition, but also the way that we show love. There's this concept in popular culture of different love languages. For some people it's gifts, and for some people it's words, and for some people it's deeds. These are all signs of love when we do these things for people, and we remember these times or make ourselves present for them and commiserate. We share our own losses with them. And so that gives us a place of commonality and community.
Mm-hmm.
This is the way of life. If death is a part of life and everything that lives dies, we know that this will happen to us too. But that's why we make the most of the life that we have. I remember once when the famous atheist and scientist Richard Dawkins was once asked, well, if you don't believe in heaven, how can you get up in the morning? And his response was, that's why I get up in the morning. I only have so many days to be able to experience the world and learn things and see beauty and express my love to other people. And so I'm going to do it more and more because this is the time that I have. And that's why we say that we learn from that experience of mortality, that if we can't say I love you to the people who we still love, even if they're gone, how much more important to say I love you to the people who are here with us now while we have the chance. And it won't make it easier later, but we won't feel like we didn't say it enough.
Things you could have said, but you didn't say. That's an interest. So as we wrap up today, I would love for both of you to share key message or messages that you hope our listeners take away, both from this conversation and reading your book?
One of the key messages is to understand that they're not alone and that there is a community. And as you were saying, that what we are speaking from a perspective, from a Jewish perspective, can be applied to other people. A woman commented to me last Friday when I did a presentation about the book. She said, "I'm not Jewish, but I found like-minded people at this particular congregation." And she said, "Reading your book made me smile because I knew that I wasn't alone." And that moved me so deeply. So I think that at a very broad level, for people to understand they're not alone, there is a community. And then at a very personal level is to realize, I think, as I tried to say before, that the level of your grief is really proportional to the level of your love. And it's not easy to go through a grieving process and to suffer a loss, but by the same token, it helps you understand you're not alone. You're not alone. And the final point I would say, again, is to reiterate that what works for one person might not work for another, and that's okay. To give yourself a lot of permission to grieve, permission to remember, permission to share, and sometimes permission just to take time just for yourself and just by yourself, that it doesn't always have to be interactive and extroverted and outgoing. Sometimes there's a time for introspection too.
I want to build on what Jodi was saying. It's not just permission, it's encouragement.
Mm-hmm.
It's empowerment. It's telling you that your choices matter. What's meaningful to you is enough justification. Dignity is its own reward. Sherwin Wine, who was, as I said, our founding thinker, and we concluded the introduction of the book with this, would sometimes describe the life of a humanistic Jew as the life of courage, where you have to live without guarantees. There's no being or beings making sure that everything comes out for the best. There's no safety net, but we can still find happiness and we can still experience joy and excitement. We love not because the love is forever, but because the love is limited. That's why we express that love so meaningfully and so deeply. And we are in charge of our own lives. We work together in community, but we also get to make choices for ourselves. And that was the essence of humanistic Judaism when it started.
Right.
If the old version didn't speak in the words that we believed, then we had the power to write new words or to adapt old words or to draw from other sources that spoke to our minds and our hearts and expressed our values and demonstrated who we wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
So this volume, Contemporary Humanistic Judaism, at its root, is about empowering people of any tradition to explore their tradition and find how they can connect who they are with where their people, ancestry, culture, and identity come from. We have plenty of people when we marry a couple or one partner is Jewish and one partner is not from a Jewish background, and we describe a cultural Jewish identity, and the other person says, well, that's sort of how I am. You know, I have a Christmas tree, but I never go to church.
Right.
Or I do Easter eggs, but I don't believe in a death and resurrection story in Easter time. It's a cultural identity, and so if we are a model for other people who want to find a way to connect to their culture, but through this human-focused approach, then Mazel Tov, wonderful. We've done a successful expression of who we are and helped other people too.
That was a great way to reflect on the importance of a community in all aspects of our life, especially in grief and individual power to make your own action, and that will drive healing. So if you could tell us, where could our audience get your book?
Well, you can find it on Amazon, both in print and ebook.
Okay.
It's Contemporary Humanistic Judaism. The publisher is the Jewish Publication Society, and their website is jps.org, and they'll have links to information, or you can search for the book there as well. If you want to see some videos that we've done from our book launch event or an interview program that we did as well, we've also posted those on the YouTube channel of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, and their YouTube channel is IISHJ VID, and people can search for us there as well.
I would just add one other thing, that if there are other smaller communities that are interested in reading it together, we put together a study and discussion guide that is available at jps.org. And it's available to be downloaded for free.
Great. So all those links for the publisher's website, the video links, all those will be included in the show notes. So you can just click there and get to it. Thank you so much. This has been such a meaningful conversation, and I'm honored and grateful that you joined me here. To our listeners, I encourage you to reflect on how you can support someone in your community who is grieving. Share your thoughts with us, and let's continue this conversation together. Thank you for joining me today on Break the Silence, Build the Future. Until the next episode, bye for now.